I was thrown out of my home at midnight just because I was pregnant unexpectedly. My name is Audrey. I am 19 years old, and my world shattered on a freezing porch in Silver Spring. A ripped bag containing my old clothes sailed through the doorway, landing with a heavy splash into a puddle. My adoptive mother stood there with her arms crossed, her face twisted with disgust as she stared at me. "You are an absolute disgrace," she sneered. "Bringing a child under my roof. You ruined our reputation, and I will not spend another dime feeding a worthless burden." My adoptive father stepped up behind her without a single ounce of pity. "You are completely on your own," he stated coldly. "Do not ever come back." He slammed the heavy door shut. The sharp click of the deadbolt echoed loudly, leaving me stranded in the dead of night. Having nowhere to go, I dragged myself to a nearby bus stop. I huddled under the narrow awning, trembling from the biting wind, and tightly gripped the silver cross pendant around my neck. It was the only keepsake from my late adoptive grandfather, who took me in as a toddler. I thought my life was over. But this ruthless eviction was actually the key to unlocking a massive secret about my true identity. If you love stories where hidden truths finally come to light and brutal karma hits hard, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button. Let's dive into what happened the very next morning. Sitting alone at a dimly lit bus stop, the cold wind forced my mind back to the day my real nightmare began. 8 years ago, Roland passed away following a devastating battle with a severe illness. He was the only person who ever treated me with genuine kindness since taking me in. The very afternoon we returned from his somber funeral, Seth and Marian wasted no time stripping away the small comforts I had previously known. They unceremoniously hauled my belongings out of my proper bedroom, shoving my meager possessions into a cramped, windowless storage closet near the drafty kitchen. That isolating space immediately became my new quarters, marking the exact moment my life abruptly shifted into a grueling existence as their unpaid, live-in servant. Under their oppressive authority, I was forced to take on every exhausting household chore. While their biological children lounged comfortably watching television for hours on end, I was on my hands and knees scrubbing the floors until my skin was raw. I handled the heavy laundry, prepared every elaborate meal, and meticulously maintained the entire property without receiving a single word of gratitude. My daily sustenance consisted strictly of cold leftovers scraped carelessly from their plates long after everyone else had finished dining. Complaining was never an option because any minor display of exhaustion resulted in harsh emotional punishments and even longer lists of impossible daily tasks. Despite the relentless physical labor draining my energy, I somehow managed to focus on my education, eventually completing high school with excellent academic marks. I secretly applied for university scholarships and actually received a prestigious acceptance letter that felt like my sole ticket out of that deeply toxic environment. However, Seth deliberately intercepted the mail and maliciously hid the official admission documents. When I finally discovered the truth and confronted him about my educational future, he coldly refused to sign the mandatory guardian consent forms required for my enrollment. He made it abundantly clear that my only recognized purpose was to remain permanently trapped in that house to serve his family indefinitely. Looking back through the lens of my current misery, the true foundation of their cruelty was rooted in a distinct memory I had suppressed for years. I vividly recalled wandering the dark hallway late one night shortly after Roland's passing. The heavy wooden door to his private study was left slightly ajar, revealing Seth sitting at the large oak desk illuminated by a single lamp. The surface was completely covered with official financial documents and thick legal folders. I watched quietly as he frantically forged signatures on paper after paper before hastily stuffing the documents into large manila envelopes. The exact moment he heard my soft footsteps, his head snapped up. Pure panic flashed across his face before he leaped from the leather chair, marching toward me with sheer rage, and violently slammed the door shut right in my face. I never fully understood the profound legal significance of those mysterious papers back then, knowing only that I was entirely trapped under their guardianship. Having absolutely no financial resources and lacking any independent civil rights as a vulnerable minor, I was forcefully subjected to their relentless exploitation year after year. They systematically isolated me from the outside world, ensuring I remained a silent prisoner within those walls. My desperate endurance stretched on endlessly until the sudden reality of my unplanned pregnancy provided them with the perfect excuse they had been waiting for. It was never truly about the moral disgrace they loudly claimed I brought upon their family name. It was simply their ultimate opportunity to discard me completely while keeping their sinister secrets buried. The next morning, my friend from church, Carrie, brought me to take an emergency cleaning job at a breathtaking mansion in Potomac. I stepped into the massive Vance estate looking entirely disheveled and still damp, feeling profoundly insecure as I waited quietly inside their grand living room. The sheer opulence of the sprawling property was completely overwhelming compared to the cramped storage closet I had grown accustomed to. Towering ceilings adorned with sparkling crystal chandeliers cast a brilliantly cold glow over the pristine marble floors, making my worn clothes and exhausted posture feel incredibly out of place. I kept my head bowed, nervously wringing my hands while desperately hoping the wealthy owners would simply hand me a long list of chores without paying any attention to my miserable appearance. Carrie gave my shoulder a reassuring squeeze before stepping away to fetch the necessary cleaning supplies, leaving me standing awkwardly alone near the sweeping central staircase. Soft footsteps echoed gracefully from the upper landing before Lady Veronica slowly descended the sweeping mahogany steps to formally assign the morning duties. She possessed an elegant and undeniably refined aura, yet a deep, lingering sorrow seemed to quietly shadow her graceful movements. I respectfully kept my gaze lowered until she paused just a few feet away, preparing to give her strict instructions. However, the exact moment she attempted to speak her first word, her voice caught sharply in her throat. She stopped completely still, her eyes locking intensely onto my face, as if she had just witnessed a ghost materializing directly in her hallway. The severe shock radiating from her pale expression made me shrink back slightly, completely unaware that my facial features were virtually identical to her own from decades ago. The tense silence stretching between us grew incredibly heavy as she took a trembling step closer, her breathing turning shallow and erratic. Feeling increasingly uncomfortable under her piercing scrutiny, I nervously reached up to tuck a damp strand of hair behind my left ear. That simple motion inadvertently exposed a small crescent-shaped birthmark resting permanently on my skin, right below my hairline. Veronica gasped audibly, her wide eyes darting frantically from that specific mark straight down to my chest. Her frantic gaze finally anchored on the intricate silver cross pendant resting heavily against my collarbone, the very same necklace I had fiercely protected my entire life through every hardship. All the elegant composure she possessed vanished instantly, replaced by a raw emotional breakdown that defied all logic. Her hands shook violently as the delicate porcelain teacup she was holding slipped from her fragile grasp, shattering into countless jagged pieces against the flawless marble floor. Hot tea splashed across the pristine tiles, but she did not even flinch or look down at the chaotic mess. "Come here. That girl. And that necklace." She choked out those fragmented words before releasing a gut-wrenching sob that echoed painfully throughout the massive estate. The agonizing sound of her weeping immediately triggered a panicked response from the upper floor. Her husband, Mitchell Vance, rushed down the staircase 2 steps at a time, his face etched with pure alarm as he desperately reached out to catch his collapsing wife. He instinctively wrapped his strong arms around her trembling shoulders, demanding in a firm but terrified voice to know exactly what had happened to cause such an extreme reaction. But as he followed her tear-filled gaze directly toward me, the frantic protective energy leaving his body completely evaporated. He looked intently at my face, immediately recognizing the structural similarities, then looked down at his weeping wife, and finally stared back at the tarnished silver pendant. Mitchell was stunned into absolute silence, his towering presence entirely neutralized, as he became instantly paralyzed by the undeniable physical match standing right inside his home. Mitchell immediately drove us himself to a high-end DNA testing center to request their expedited 48-hour emergency service. The luxury vehicle was cloaked in a heavy contemplative silence, during the short trip punctuated only by Veronica occasionally reaching back to gently squeeze my trembling hand. The clinical swab process was surprisingly swift and highly professional, utilizing expedited forensic protocols to ensure absolute accuracy. Upon returning to the sprawling estate, Mitchell guided me gently toward the plush living room sofa and retrieved a heavily worn leather-bound photo album from a locked mahogany cabinet. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the thick cover to reveal countless faded pictures of a joyful toddler wearing the exact same silver cross pendant I currently wore. With a voice thick with unresolved grief, he recounted the agonizing afternoon 16 years ago when their precious 3-year-old daughter vanished without a trace from a crowded public park during a brief moment of distraction. He detailed the massive statewide private investigations, the endless heartbreaking dead ends, and the profound emotional exhaustion that had severely drained their souls over the past decade and a half. "We never stopped looking for you. Not for a single day," Mitchell said, his voice choking up as he turned each old photo. "I don't even need the paper to know you are mine." The subsequent 2 days of waiting could have been agonizingly tense, but Veronica purposefully transformed that critical time into a period of profound healing. She consciously avoided dwelling on the tragic past or asking invasive questions about my recent trauma, focusing entirely on my immediate physical well-being and the fragile life growing inside me. Booking an exclusive appointment, she personally chauffeured me to an elite private hospital for a comprehensive prenatal checkup, holding my hand tightly while the ultrasound technician assured us my unborn baby was perfectly healthy. Afterward, we spent hours visiting several upscale maternity boutiques where she meticulously selected the softest cashmere sweaters, breathable fabrics, and the most comfortable dresses, insisting on providing everything I fundamentally lacked. Her gentle maternal instincts wrapped around me like a physical protective shield, offering a profound sense of absolute security I had never genuinely experienced before. Exactly 48 hours later, the sharp ring of Mitchell's private office phone abruptly pierced the quiet afternoon anticipation. He answered the call immediately, gripping the receiver with white knuckles, while Veronica and I sat completely frozen together on the velvet sofa. He listened silently to the medical director in the tense room for what felt like an absolute eternity, his rigid posture slowly softening before he gently lowered the device. Turning his intense gaze toward us, his stoic, authoritative facade completely crumbled as heavy, unashamed tears finally spilled over his cheeks. He gave a firm, definitive nod, his voice breaking entirely as he confirmed the laboratory had officially established a 99.9% biological match. A powerful wave of overwhelming relief instantly washed through the expansive room as Veronica pulled me into a fierce, desperate embrace, sobbing openly against my shoulder while continuously whispering my name. Mitchell quickly crossed the floor and joined us, wrapping his strong arms securely around both of us to form an unbreakable circle of unconditional love. In that profound, life-altering moment, I was no longer a discarded orphan sleeping in a storage closet or a despised servant subjected to daily cruelty. I was officially the cherished daughter of the Vance family who had miraculously found her way back home. The genuine warmth radiating from my actual parents effectively eradicated the deeply ingrained humiliation, the bitter cold, and the relentless emotional starvation I had been violently forced to endure over the past 8 agonizing years. The following morning, I sat inside my father's private office alongside a longtime family lawyer. The seasoned legal expert had spent the previous evening conducting a comprehensive, meticulous investigation into the municipal probate records, successfully uncovering a monumental secret regarding my hidden past. Roland had never actually bequeathed his substantial financial assets to his biological son, fully recognizing his son's inherently corrupt and deeply selfish nature. Instead, my late adoptive grandfather had discreetly established a highly protected, irrevocable trust fund, officially designating me as the absolute sole beneficiary of his entire accumulated estate, ensuring my financial security long after his passing. Roland knew Seth was greedy. The lawyer explained, pushing a thick, heavily tabbed manila file across the polished mahogany desk toward us. He left everything to protect you, but Seth used a legal loophole to become your guardian. Hearing those precise words caused the fragmented memories from my miserable childhood to violently snap into crystal clear focus, replacing my lingering confusion with profound disgust. I finally comprehended the sinister reality behind Seth's frantic, shadowy behavior inside that dark study 8 agonizing years ago. He had meticulously forged countless critical financial documents to unlawfully seize total administrative control over the massive inheritance specifically meant for my secure future. The relentless exploitation I subsequently endured was never merely about extracting free household labor for their personal convenience or saving money. It was a highly calculated, malicious psychological strategy carefully designed to keep me completely isolated from the rest of society. By forcing me into the grueling role of an unpaid domestic servant and deliberately denying my university enrollment, they successfully prevented me from ever interacting with the outside world, understanding the broader legal system, or discovering my fundamental civil rights as an independent adult. The attorney then directed our focused attention toward a specific fiduciary clause, highlighted within the complex paperwork, revealing a deeply disturbing truth about my recent traumatic eviction. He emphatically stated that Seth aggressively throwing me out into the freezing midnight rain was not a spontaneous emotional reaction to my unplanned pregnancy. It was a cold, heavily premeditated legal maneuver orchestrated with absolute ruthless precision. By forcefully driving me off the property, he intended to officially report me to the local authorities as a volatile, rebellious runaway who had voluntarily abandoned her permanent residence. Manufacturing that highly specific fraudulent narrative would automatically grant him the perfect legal justification to completely drain the remaining trust fund balances before I legally reached my 21st birthday, thereby permanently erasing any documented trace of his prolonged financial embezzlement. My father abruptly slammed his fist against the heavy wooden desk, his eyes burning with intense protective fury, as he immediately demanded filing a massive civil lawsuit to utterly destroy the people who had mercilessly tortured me. However, the experienced attorney calmly raised a hand, strongly advising against that impulsive, anger-driven reaction. He clarified that while standard civil litigation would eventually recover the stolen funds, initiating a basic lawsuit would simply provide Seth with ample opportunity to panic shred crucial banking evidence, systematically launder the remaining assets, or flee the current jurisdiction entirely. To secure an airtight criminal arrest warrant and absolutely guarantee significant federal prison time for wire fraud, tax evasion, and severe conservatorship abuse, law enforcement desperately needed undeniable, spontaneous proof straight from the perpetrator's mouth. The lawyer firmly concluded that the police required a direct, legally obtained audio recording of Seth explicitly admitting that he had forcefully evicted me and unlawfully controlled my inherited wealth without my knowledge. That afternoon, the seasoned attorney quickly contacted local law enforcement to legally configure a secure encrypted recording application directly onto my personal mobile phone. Before I left my father's office, the lead detective carefully instructed me to keep the conversation incredibly focused, emphasizing that I needed to extract a highly specific confession without raising any immediate suspicion. An unmarked police cruiser subsequently transported me back to the familiar neighborhood, parking inconspicuously, just 1 block away from the dreaded Silver Spring residence to avoid drawing any unwanted attention from the neighbors. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked the remaining distance entirely alone, my heart pounding a steady rhythm as I steadily approached the deeply unwelcoming suburban structure. I confidently ascended the creaking wooden steps of the front porch and knocked firmly on the heavy door, finding immense comfort in the absolute certainty that the waiting detectives were actively monitoring every single audio frequency from their remote surveillance vehicle. Marian yanked the door open almost immediately, clearly expecting a delivery or a random solicitor. The very second her harsh eyes landed on my solitary figure, she crossed her arms tightly over her chest, and a deeply condescending smirk twisted her thin lips. She practically radiated malicious triumph, instantly launching into a relentless barrage of cruel, unfiltered mockery without missing a single beat. She loudly proclaimed to the entire street that she always knew I would never survive out in the harsh real world without their strict financial guidance and daily supervision. She sneered aggressively at my visibly exhausted condition, boldly assuming I had absolutely no alternative choice but to drag my pregnant belly back to their doorstep to shamelessly beg for their unearned charity a warm meal and a safe place to sleep. Instead of defending myself against her venomous insults, I deliberately forced my facial expression into a convincing mask of pure, pathetic desperation, playing exactly into their deeply twisted superiority complex. I purposely lowered my gaze to the dusty floorboards and pleaded softly, asking if they could simply spare a tiny fraction of the financial assets Roland had originally left behind, so I could properly afford basic medical care and essential supplies for my unborn child. I even forced a few genuine tears to pool in my eyes, ensuring the performance looked completely authentic to anyone watching. This highly calculated display of fabricated humility worked absolutely perfectly to manipulate their predictable arrogance. It instantly satisfied their massive egos and successfully drew Seth out from the dark depths of the house to join his arrogant wife at the front entrance. "You have nothing," Seth shouted mockingly from the living room as he aggressively approached the doorway to tower intimidatingly over me. "I kicked you out and I control every penny Roland left. You're legally a runaway now, so get off my porch before I call the cops." He stood there, puffing his chest with absolute sickening pride, completely oblivious to the catastrophic mistake he had just confidently made. He fundamentally failed to realize that his explicit verbal confirmation of illegally evicting me and intentionally maintaining full control over my rightful inheritance was currently being transmitted directly to the waiting law enforcement agents parked nearby. He had essentially handed over his own criminal conviction on a silver platter because of his insatiable need to constantly assert dominance. With the undeniable criminal evidence successfully secured on the active, uninterrupted audio feed, I no longer needed to maintain my pitiful, subservient facade. I took a deliberate, measured step backward, slowly straightening my posture to stand remarkably tall against the chilling afternoon wind. I dropped the desperate demeanor entirely, allowing a profound sense of newfound power to wash over me. I looked completely past their arrogant smirks to stare dead into their cold eyes, letting a glacial, unyielding silence settle heavily over the porch as my desperate theatrical act officially ended, leaving them briefly confused by my sudden dramatic shift in attitude. Deafening sirens abruptly shattered the quiet suburban stillness as 3 marked police cruisers tore down the familiar Silver Spring Street, their flashing red and blue lights painting the neighborhood houses in frantic colors. Heavily equipped local officers rushed up the creaking wooden steps of the porch before Seth could even attempt to retreat inside the hallway. The lead detective swiftly presented the official arrest warrants directly to his face, while multiple officers expertly subdued the deeply shocked couple right at the threshold. The arrogant smirks that had permanently resided on their faces just seconds prior instantly dissolved into expressions of absolute unadulterated panic as the severe reality of their criminal exposure finally crashed down upon them. They were completely paralyzed by the sudden overwhelming law enforcement presence swarming their previously isolated property. Marian flailed her arms wildly in a desperate, pathetic bid to resist the stern officers tightening their unyielding grips firmly on her shoulders. She frantically twisted her body away from the uniformed personnel, desperately trying to lock eyes with me while adopting a falsely victimized persona for the rapidly gathering crowd. "Wait, this is a mistake. She's my daughter." Marian screamed hysterically aggressively, struggling against the restraining officers as the heavy steel handcuffs clicked decisively into place around her wrists. The chaotic commotion on the porch briefly paused as the sleek black sedan parked securely behind the barricade of flashing police vehicles. My father stepped out of the luxury car, his immaculately tailored suit and intensely commanding aura instantly freezing the chaotic atmosphere on the front lawn. Mitchell approached the chaotic scene with measured, deliberate steps before securely wrapping his strong, deeply protective arm around my shoulders. His glacial, unforgiving gaze locked onto the two pathetic individuals who had mercilessly tormented his biological child for 8 agonizing years. He did not need to utter a single threatening word because his overwhelming authoritative presence radiating pure parental fury conveyed an undeniable promise of their total destruction. The continuous noise naturally drew numerous curious neighbors out of their respective houses, all rushing down the darkened sidewalks to witness the previously arrogant Harrison family being publicly disgraced and humiliated right on their own front lawn. Seth stood completely paralyzed beside his relentlessly screaming wife, his complexion turning a sickly ashen white as his wide eyes darted frantically from the heavily armed officers reading his Miranda rights to the incredibly powerful man currently shielding me. The horrifying realization finally struck him with the force of a freight train that I was no longer a helpless orphan completely at his mercy, and his meticulously hidden financial crimes were now thoroughly exposed to the unforgiving federal justice system. He visibly shrunk under my father's lethal glare, all of his previous bravado evaporating into thin air. I stood perfectly still on the damp grass, silently watching the stern officers forcefully shove my abusive former guardians into the cramped back seats of the waiting patrol vehicles. Not a single tear formed in my eyes, nor did the absolute slightest ounce of pity flutter within my chest as the heavy car doors slammed shut on their thoroughly corrupted futures. They were finally experiencing the exact same profound helplessness they had intentionally inflicted upon me for nearly a decade. Taking a deep, cleansing breath of the crisp evening air, I decisively turned my back on that pathetic scene without looking over my shoulder a second time. I confidently slid into the comfortable passenger seat of my father's waiting vehicle, completely and permanently leaving that hellish suburban house securely buried in my past. 3 months passed, and the heavy mahogany courtroom doors closed permanently, officially concluding the intensely dark chapter bearing the Harrison family name. The presiding federal judge delivered a remarkably harsh but entirely justified verdict, sentencing Seth and Marian to lengthy consecutive terms in a high-security federal prison facility. They were found unequivocally guilty of egregious financial fraud, extensive wire manipulation, and severe conservatorship abuse, following a remarkably brief jury deliberation. The relentless legal system systematically dismantled their fraudulently built lives, resulting in the immediate and unforgiving bank foreclosure of their suburban Silver Spring residence. Every single remaining financial asset they possessed was swiftly seized by government authorities to partially compensate for the massive restitution ordered by the court. The final gavel drop left the previously arrogant couple with absolutely nothing but the stark, inescapable reality of their well-deserved confinement behind thick iron bars. Shortly after attending the final sentencing hearing, my biological parents accompanied me to a quiet local cemetery to visit Roland's peaceful resting place. I approached his simple headstone and gently laid a beautiful fresh bouquet of white chrysanthemums against the cool granite base. Standing there in the gentle afternoon breeze, I silently thanked the late old man for providing the only genuine, untainted affection I had ever known during my highly vulnerable early childhood. However, turning my back and stepping away from that solemn gravesite also symbolized my definitive, uncompromising closure. I was firmly saying a final goodbye to the deeply traumatic history associated with his wicked descendants, completely severing any lingering emotional ties to the agonizing decades spent trapped entirely in their intensely oppressive shadow. When it finally came time to resolve the newly recovered trust fund, I carefully chose a highly balanced, incredibly practical approach rather than blindly discarding the entire recovered fortune. I deliberately retained a sensible portion of the inherited wealth to ensure a comfortable, deeply stable foundation for my rapidly approaching journey into first-time motherhood. The substantial remaining majority of those recovered millions was officially redirected to permanently establish the Roland Foundation. I purposefully created this dedicated charitable organization specifically to provide comprehensive educational college scholarships and vital transitional housing support for abandoned at-risk teenagers. I desperately wanted to guarantee that other highly vulnerable youth would never be forced to endure the same isolating, malicious exploitation I had miraculously survived without any outside protection. My personal nightmare beautifully concluded on a brilliantly sunny afternoon while standing on the sweeping stone terrace of the breathtaking Potomac estate. I stood comfortably overlooking the lush, impeccably manicured green gardens, gently caressing my noticeably rounded belly as my unborn baby fluttered softly inside. Officially and legally recognized as Audrey Vance, I felt an overwhelming, unprecedented sense of profound internal peace radiating through my veins. I was no longer a terrified, discarded runaway desperately bracing for the next cruel punishment, but a deeply cherished daughter confidently preparing to welcome new life alongside my true, unconditionally loving family. My harrowing journey ultimately proves that the absolute truth can never remain permanently buried in the dark, regardless of how expertly it is hidden. Malicious greed and the highly calculated exploitation of defenseless individuals will inevitably face the severe, uncompromising wrath of natural karma. True family is never defined by abusive people simply sharing a physical roof to relentlessly manipulate your innocent existence. It is powerfully forged by those deeply devoted individuals who absolutely never stop looking for you, no matter how many heartbreaking years pass. Thank you so much for listening to my emotional story until the very end. Please leave a comment down below to share your personal thoughts on how justice was ultimately served today. And please do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible, life-changing stories.